Those of you who have seen previous videos, or even more important, who have read my books, have very kindly often sent in, 90% of you have sent in thank you notes. And it's marvellous because many people who are scattered around the world, and here you are, I call MacDonald, and you've grown up in Australia, and your father grew up in Australia, and there's some vague family tradition that you came from the British Isles. You don't know quite why you came from the British Isles, and you might even go back, and the first thing you'll do when you get to Scotland is to look where all the MacDonalds lived. And a lot of these people have kindly written in to say thank you very much for the indications I could give of why their ancestors left the Highlands. I know, especially in our modern society, where it is a kind of restless society. You grow up in one place, you live in somewhere else, and then somewhere else again, and then you get married and you live somewhere else. I've lived in a dozen places in England. I won't tell you all the places I've lived in, but when somebody comes up to me at a party and says, "Where are you from?" my answer is, if you have a couple of hours, I'll tell you where I'm from. But short of that, I'd find it very difficult. But so people like to know where they're from. In earlier societies, you knew where you were from. And in fact, even not long ago, in our society, you could have a good idea where you were from. My own family, if we're talking about the father's side, my father began work in a brickyard at the age of 12. His father and all his ancestors were coal miners in County Durham. And where my father lived was a big, collier town put up by the Concert Iron Company, because the Concert Iron Company opened a big iron foundry in Concert, County Durham, and if you want to smelt iron, you've got to have plenty of coal, so they opened coal mines all around. So that's where my grandfather worked, and let me tell you, he started work at the age of 9. The legal age then was 10. But he started working the lead mines in Cumberland, the age of 9, because if you look 10, and if the employer was prepared to blink at your birth certificate and your parents would be quite glad of the money, then you could start work even earlier. So he started work at the age of 9, and then he kept working, and he retired, believe it or not, at the age of 73. Makes me tired just to think of it. That was his life's work, 64 years, when he would hardly have had any time off at all. There are no paid holidays in those happy days. You'd be going down the mine every day for 64 years. And it obviously hadn't tired him out, because after he retired at 73, he lived on till the age of 94. So he wasn't exhausted. Perhaps, I remember him well, perhaps it was an advantage to be fairly short in stature, because if you were too high, as I found out when I worked in the coal mines in South Wales, doing my national service just after the war, if you were too high, you were going along they call it a road, a tunnel, and perhaps the tunnel would be going down to 4'6" before they came along and knocked a bit of more ceiling off it to make it higher. So if you were walking along a 4'6" tunnel, you had to walk over bent double practically, and if you were tall, that would increase your chances of crashing your head against the top. In fact, I remember the three officials in the district I worked in Padachta Colliery, South Wales. 3 were going out at the end of the shift, about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and one of them, who was what they call a fireman, because they all had to have little fire lamps, which would show you when there was dangerous deposits of gas. And these 3 firemen were all walking out. One of them hit his head on the top, which is easy enough to do, straightened up, hit his head. And then afterwards he said, yes, I'm okay. So they all walked on another quarter of a mile. And this poor chap who'd hit his head said, I don't feel too well, sat down on the ground and died. And they found out afterwards he'd broken his neck. So he'd walked a quarter of a mile with a broken neck. How that happened, Lord knows. So the other 2, who'd walked out as a jovial little party of 3, ended up carrying a corpse up to the pit head, where the lifts were, the man cages to take them up to the top. So my grandfather was fairly short, and I often thought it perhaps helps him not to hit his head too often at the top. But everybody likes to know where they came from, and I trace, because people think, oh, you must be a Highlander or descended from Highlanders, and I have to confess, no trace of Highland blood in me. I've got 8 great-grandparents, all English to the core, all born, lived and died in England. But if I trace my father's ancestors back, there is one of them who appeared the very furthest back in the most northerly county, most northerly parish in England, in Cumberland, and he got married there in about 1709. And I think it's very significant that in 1707, England and Scotland had joined into one country. So there was no longer a border between the 2. So you could cross frequently, easily, without any problem. So that's what he did. I haven't gone any further back, but I suppose he was probably a Scotsman coming from Dumfriesshire, where there are more edges than anywhere else in the country. So, lots of people have written in to say thank you very much, and I've got 1 or 2 people, or I had one here before, who wrote in to say, I disagree with your explanation of the Highland clearances. Perhaps you had better read a historically accurate account. Well, thank you very much. Such as the poor had no lawyers. Now, I was understanding it all up to the last bit, because The Poor Had No Lawyers is a marvellous book, and you should read it. And it's exactly the same approach that I had. Absolutely the same. So whether he was not able to understand what I was saying, or whether not able to understand what The Poor Had No Lawyers were saying, I don't know. But if you, by all means, write in to say you disagree with me. For example, another one wrote in to say, oh, you've got it quite wrong, because I, among other things, I had to go through the regular Orthodox history of the Highlands, and there are as many as 8 or 9 things which appear over and over and over again in all the Orthodox histories, and they're all completely wrong. And one of them was the Highlanders were all Catholic, and the Catholic Highlanders did this, and the Highlanders were always loyal to the Pope. Well, they weren't. I'm sorry, I don't mind whether they were Catholics or not. All I'm going after is it true? I'm not a Catholic or a Protestant, so I don't care what they were. So I merely go back to the evidence, which is that about 12 or 13,000 Highlanders were Catholics in the 1750s, and the same in the 1790s. And you might say, for example, and why do I know? Because in the 1750s, there was a chap called Webster who made a complete census, amateur census, of all the parishes of Scotland, and not only the numbers of people there, but how many Protestants, how many Catholics. The answer was 12 or 13,000. There were 2 or 3 Catholic clans. The Chisholms were Catholic, the Farquharsons were Catholic, half of the MacDonalds were Catholic, the MacDonalds of Clanranald were Catholic, although other MacDonalds, the MacDonalds of Keppel and the main Clandonald were Protestant, but the Clanranalds were Catholic. But after you've said, okay, there were certain clans that were Catholic, that's all you can say. All the others were Protestant. And so all you have to do is to get a piece of paper and a pencil and add up the number of people in each parish who were Protestants and who were Catholics. And when you go through to the 1790s, that's when another important survey was made. There was a chap called Sir John Sinclair, who was in fact a Highland landlord up in Caithness, where the Sinclairs come from, and he was interested in statistics. In fact, it is to John Sinclair that we owe the word statistics. We didn't have it before him, and he took it from the German language and brought it into English. So before him there were no statistical accounts because there were no statistics. So he wrote to all the parsons in the whole of Scotland in the 1790s and asked them all, Lowland and Highland, and asked them all a lot of questions, including how many people are in your parish, how many Protestant, how many Catholic, and lots of other details about what do they do for a living, how many big farms, how many small farms, what are the surnames in your parish, and so on. And virtually all of them, all the ministers wrote back, and all these were printed in what is called the Statistical Account of Scotland, which goes from 1791 up to 1799. That's when it was all published in 20 volumes. And it's now called the Old Statistical Account because half a century afterwards, a lot of people thought that was a very good idea, we'll do it again. And so they got all the ministers in Scotland in the 1830s and 40s to write in accounts of their parishes. And that was called the New Statistical Account. So the old one, the Sinclair one in the 1790s, has since then been called the Old Statistical Account. And again, the ministers put in the numbers of Catholics and the numbers of Protestants. Now it's possible that you may say, oh well, they were all Protestant, perhaps they were not giving correct figures. But go to the Catholic records themselves. The Pope in about the 1750s or 60s sent a special envoy over to the Highlands to tell him how many Catholics there were still in the Highlands, and the answer was about 13,000, which is exactly the same as you would work out from the 1750s amateur census and the 1790s OSA, Old Statistical Account. So what more evidence have you got? By all means tell me I'm wrong, but what I wanted then, I read on hastily after this chap told me I was completely wrong. Yeah, I was expecting him to say, I know some original records, and if you read those, you will find that you're wrong. But he didn't say that. So why he decided that I was wrong, I suppose possibly he's brought up in a Catholic school and was told that all the Highlanders were Catholic. I don't know. But I can only go on the evidence. I'm sorry, I can't go on anything else. I would quite happy to, but if you decide to go on anything else, it becomes what we call fiction, which is crossing a big line. What I'm writing is non-fiction. What happened? Every sentence I wrote had to pass my eagle eye, examining it and saying, is this true or not? And if it was not true, out it goes. Everybody else, or almost everybody else, who writes a history of the Highlands simply opens all the other books on Highland history and copies them. And you can see why. I mean, I went to Oxford, read history there, and a number of people I knew there went on to become fellows of colleges and historians. And if you wanted to become an academic historian and a fellow of a college, what do? You go up before all the fellows of the college and they say, why do you want to be a historian? Well, I've written a history of the Highlands and I've decided, this applicant said, I've decided that the histories that you have written pointing to one of the fellows is quite wrong. So is he going to get that chap's vote to become a fellow? Of course he isn't. He's going to be out on his ear. And he's in a hurry because he's got married, he's got kids, he's got to pay the mortgage, he's got to pay for the weekly groceries. I was in a completely happy position of being able to get on with my work without worrying all that. But the other people can't. You've got to have a job. So what kind of history do you write? You write the kind of history that goes along with all your seniors, all the people who are going to give you a job or not. All the people who, when you send up your history to a publishing house, because a publishing house can't be expert on everything, so a publishing house gets a new history of Scotland or history of the Highlands, and there isn't anybody there who every topic which is covered, he knows about it. So what they do is they get somebody to read it, and they send it to a well-known professor of history in Oxford. And he says, this chap is talking nonsense. Why? Because he says I'm wrong. What else do you expect? You can't expect me to say, well, this chap says I'm completely wrong, and of course I agree with them 100%, and I have taken steps to pay all my salary back to the college, which I've been getting under false pretenses all these years. Of course he doesn't say that. He says he's wrong. I'm right and he's wrong. So you won't become a historian, academic historian, if you are deciding to say that everybody else, all the seniors in your profession, are wrong. You won't do it. I am free of that insistence on copying out other people's history, so I can put down only what I know to be true. And I don't care if everybody else has said it. I was reading this morning somebody called Eric Craigeen. He was writing, he said, of course there was an enormous population increase in the Highlands between 1750 and 1790, second half of the 18th century. And then, for example, he gives one parish where there was an enormous increase. But do you have to explain, do you have to take him to one side and say, if you're talking about 162 parishes, it's no good saying, for example, this parish has an enormous population. It was Tyree, as a matter of fact, where the owner, Duke of Argyll, wanted all the people, as many people as you could get, to make kelp, which made a vast fortune for the Duke of Argyll. That's why all the people were there. But one person, one parish is proof. I remember writing to, I forget what he was called now, Earl of something. He was a member of the government at the time, and he was a big landowner in Scotland. And I brought up this question of the population of the Highland in the 18th century, and he wrote back to me, there was an explosive population increase in the Highland. Well now, if you read the Orthodox histories, that's the conclusion you will draw. I did read the Orthodox history, but then I went and examined how many people in each parish in 1750, how many people in each parish in 1800. And there were, in the whole Highlands, about 10% more. Now 10%, 290,000 at the beginning, 320,000 at the end. At the same time as the food produced went up by leaps and bounds. New crops, new ways of growing, new ways of ploughing, everything was new, and much more food was produced. So they could have fed twice as many Highlanders, and in fact it went up by 10%. Anybody could have done this work and added up all the population figures in the 1790s, in the 1750s, and then in the 1790s, but it's hard work. And I was doing this, I have to admit, before I even had a calculator. So it was a piece of paper and a pencil and adding up 162 figures. And at the end you think, I better check that, and you go through it again and you get 2 more or 3 less. So you'd have to go through it again and again before you could decide you got an accurate figure. But why couldn't they do it? They could have done it, but the end of all that would have been to write a book which says that the big people in this profession are all wrong. And you don't get people doing that. It was taking the bread out of the mouths of their families, stopping their mortgage payment. They go along with what will give them a job. I didn't have to do it. That is why my opinions were collected not from what all the Orthodox historians said, but by going back to the original people who were writing in the 18th century, who knew what they were talking about, and then you were prepared to do all the work, adding it all up. So if people write in to say you've got it all wrong, like, oh, you're wrong about the Catholic, by all means do so, but please add on, this is why I know you're wrong. I've got these figures from such a place, tell me what it is, and so I can go and have a look at it. It's no good just writing to say, you're no good, boo. Obviously you can say that, but it's not going to persuade anybody. So, as I say, by all means write in, and particularly if you're saying you enjoyed my book and you found out where my ancestors may well have come from. But please, if you say I'm wrong, it's a free country, you say I'm wrong if you want to, but tell me why I'm wrong. Not merely, you're wrong, full stop, I've signed my name. Thank you.